Hey friends, Mr. Ward, and today we're going to be reading the very last 3 chapters of Secret of the Indian. So, hope you guys enjoy. It's been really fun reading these Indian in the Cupboard books, so let's get to it. Chapter 17, The Big Blow. Quick, give me the key! She didn't hesitate now, but thrust the key at him, snatching the red girl at the same time from his other hand. Omri stumbled across to the chest. Bring the seed tray! Hurry! He gasped as the thudding of feet on the lower stairway got louder. He could hear their voices, querulous, anxious, Mr. Johnson's the loudest, dominating their questions. No room for further doubt. Biological phenomenon saw with my own eyes. Wait, no time for 2 operations. Do it all at once. Omri opened the chest, grabbed the seed tray out of Emma's hands, and put it in the bottom next to Patrick's feet. He was aware of Emma leaning closely over him and slammed down the lid. His hand was so unsteady, they were nearly at the door, that it took 2 or 3 stabs before he could thrust the key into the lock, and then he turned it. What happened next was something that he could never afterward remember clearly, and yet would never, ever forget. The main memory, later, was of stupendous noise, a deafening roar that filled the room to bursting, but the pressure of the sound was not what threw him and Emma right across the room and slammed them backwards against the wall. The chest. He was to remember seeing the end of his chest. It simply lifted into the air as the lid blasted open, and then it disintegrated. It simply blew outward into fragments. One bit of it hit him in the stomach and knocked the breath out of him. At the same time, something large and heavy was hurled and tumbled across the floor and struck Emma's legs. Then Omri witnessed, in a few traumatic, incredible seconds, the total destruction of his room. The skylight above his bed vanished first, and though he was too stunned to see it go, the glass erupting in a puff of sparkling dust as the violent charge that had come out of the chest roared upward through the hole in the roof. But the hole wasn't large enough, nothing like large enough to channel that black tower of pure force that detonated from the bottom to top of the little room. The edges of the square hole bent outward like rubber for a split second, and then, with a tearing, wrenching, screeching sound that could be heard distinctly through the original roaring, the whole slope of the roof disappeared. At that, everything in the room that could possibly move, all the bedding, the Japanese table, the floor cushions, the books, Omri's collections, the clock radio, and 100 other objects whirled in a blinding, terrifying tenth of a second out into the sky, as if sucked by an inhalation from the heavens. That was it. That was all inside the room. But the noise had not stopped. It had simply gone out of the house. They could still hear it outside, a wind-to-end winds. The most ferocious, destructive blast to hit England for 200 years was beginning a career that would make news all over the world. The first of several million trees it was destined to uproot was the old elm outside Omri's house that should have come down years ago, and now did so with a demolishing crash right on top of Mr. Johnson's new Porsche. The wind then proceeded at high speed down Howell Road, blowing off roofs, knocking down trees, and wrecking the happy haunts of skinheads, a maverick Texas cyclone which the weatherman had not predicted and could never explain, on its way to cause unprecedented havoc to southeast England. Omri and Emma found themselves lying on the floor on the very edge of consciousness. Omri was clutching the thing that had hit him, something sharp that dug into his hands. Emma was clutching something too. What she was clutching was Patrick. He alone did not seem to be much fazed or hurt. As the deafening noise began to fade into the distance, he sat up, rubbed his hands over his face and head, and said, "Blimey, just in time!" The other 2 stared at him glassily. He stood up, shook himself, turned, and stopped. "Crumbs," he breathed, gazing around the shell of Omri's room. He looked upward into the open sky, an angry sky still full of whirling leaves and odd fragments. The broken-off joists of the roof stuck out on the silhouette. It was like looking out through the wide-open mouth of a gigantic shark. "You know what?" he said slowly. I think I must have brought the twister back with me." "Twister?" Omri's voice came out quickly, and he found his throat was choked with dust. The air was full of it. "Yeah. A cyclone. We saw it coming up the street, whirling like a black funnel, throwing huge things into the air. It was just about on to us when..." and his hand flew to his mouth, and he turned slowly back to where Omri and Emma were lying. "Where's Boone?" he asked hollowly. "Where's Ruby Lou?" Boone. Omri had, in the panic of sending Matron and the injured Indians back, totally forgotten about Boone. His brain was working thickly. Boone. Boone had been here. Where? Where had he put him? Had he put him on the seed tray? No. He had been in the Lego house, in his matchbox bed. Omri had put him somewhere, at his own request, somewhere, out of sight. Out of sight, out of mind. Omri tried to get up, and it was a struggle. Every part of him ached and protested when he moved. He put his hand to the ground and dropped the sharp thing that had hit him, the last remains of his seaman's chest, an angle of the lid with an oblong brass plate bearing the inscription, L. Bear. As it struck the floor, he thought he heard a small extra sound, but before he could register it, it was drowned by a banging on the door and terrified voices. "Omri! Emma! Patrick, are you all right? What was it? What happened?" The three of them froze, gazing at each other. It was Emma who acted first. She scrambled stiffly to her feet and went to the door. "We're all right. Patrick's here. We're all here. The roof's blown off, but we're okay." And, "All right?" yelled Omri's mother. "You can't be. Open the door." "I can't," said Emma. "The bolt's bent." Omri's eyes raced to the bolt. There was nothing wrong with it. Brilliant, he thought admiringly. She's brilliant. That gives us a few minutes anyhow. "Omri," called his father in a shocked voice. "What was it? What was that terrible noise? The house shook like an earthquake." I think it's some kind of a freak wind, Dad," Omri managed to croak. Did you hear the tree come down? It's gone. I can't see the top branches anymore." Mr. Johnson could be heard to give a cry of anguish. "Oh, tree down! My God! My Porsche!" And they heard him rush down the stairs. "Patrick, speak to me! Speak to me!" cried Patrick's mother hysterically. I'm here, Mom. Calm down," said Patrick shortly. He was white in the face. "Listen, Dad," said Omri quickly. "We're okay. I'll take the bolt off the door, and you go and see how much damage there is. We'll be down as soon as we get the door open." "Right," said his father. "He's right. Come on, let's go down. Bloody roof's off. My conservatory must be wrecked." And he shepherded the women down the stairs, Patrick's mother still fussing shrilly. A silence fell. It was almost too much of a relief to bear. After all the terrifying uproar of the last few interminable minutes, the three of them stood still, trying to get to grips with things, and in that abrupt and welcome lull, they finally heard something that must have been going on for some time. "Help! Help! Help!" The voice, a very tiny one, seemed to come from above their heads. They craned their necks. "I don't believe it. Look up there," shouted Omri, pointing. Impaled on one of the broken roof beams was a familiar object. Its mirror was no more. Its door hung from one hinge, and most of its remaining white paint had been battered off. But there it was, still there, what was left of it, the cupboard. And that wasn't all. Clinging precariously to the bottom rim by both hands, his spurred boots kicking over an infinity of empty air, was Boone. Chapter 18, Red Satin. "Help! Get me down! Save me! I'm going to fall! Help!" How did he... Oh, never mind. Quick, we must do something. "Boone, hang on. We're coming." "How?" he squawked. "Y'all ain't got wings, and I can't hold on much longer. It's no use." His voice swooped into a disparaging dirge. "Don't bother none, fellas. It's too late to save me. I'm doomed. I accept my fate, and I just wish I hadn't lived such a rotten, no-good, hard-drinking, poker-playing life." Well, once again, Emma was the first to act sensibly. The boys were running around in circles under the dangling cupboard, bumping into each other in their hopeless search for something to climb on. Emma tore off her parka and thrust one sleeve into Omri's hand and one into Patrick's, and then, grasping the bottom edge herself and pulling it taut like a fireman's blanket, she shouted up, "Let go! We'll catch you!" Boone let go and dropped what must have seemed to him 1,000 feet, screaming all the way down. "Ah!" He hit the quilting with a tiny plop and lay there, momentarily stunned. Emma and the boys laid the parka gently on the floor. "Boone, are you okay?" asked Patrick anxiously. After a moment, Boone slowly sat up. "That's all I needed," he remarked bitterly, wincing as he felt himself all over. As if it wasn't enough to lose my hat and get crushed half to death by my best buddy. He gave Patrick a dirty look. I get blown almost to the pearly gates, and instead of finding myself a nice soft pink cloud, I'm hanging out there in space, yelling my head off, with not a living soul taking a dang bit of notice till it's nearly too late. And he wiped away a tear. He scowled around darkly and then changed his tone. Say, what hit this place anyhow? Must have been some dynamiting that went wrong. It was a cyclone from your town, from your time, Boone, and it came back with me through the magic, Patrick explained. Boone looked appalled. Say, I hope it didn't wreck the saloon. Well, if the cyclone came here, it couldn't be there at the same time, so I guess your town's safe. And by the way, so is your hat. Boone's whole manner changed. He jumped to his feet excitedly. You found my hat? Oh, I sure missed it. It's okay, Boone. It's back here waiting for you. Ruby Lou made sure to pick it up safely, and she knows you love it. Boone stared at him. You ran into Ruby? Patrick nodded. Boone's eyes began to glow. You don't say. Now, ain't she a great gal? Well, yes, she is. Well, she ain't none of your prissy, stuck-up kind neither. She's a real pal, and purty as paint, too. He heaved a wistful sigh. I wish that she was here now, you know, he confided. When I'm with Ruby, I never feel sad nor nothing, and I only cry 'cause she kind of likes me to tell her sad stories, and I can do without drinking. That little Ruby gal's as good as liquor to a man any day. Better. Well, that's the nicest thing a man ever said to me, Billy Boone. The sound of this other tiny voice was so totally unexpected that they goggled at each other before turning toward it. They stared unbelievingly. Standing up on the edge of the bit of the chest lid that Omri had dropped was a tiny figure in a red satin dress and a high-polished red boot, with blonde hair piled on her head and her hands on her hips. Patrick let out a yell of delight. Ruby, what are you doing here? Search me. But the tables are turned now, hey, Pat? Now, you're the biggin', but I don't care so long as Billy's my size. Who's going to bring me over to him so that he can give me a hug? The boys dived, but Emma got there first. She took the tiny figure of Ruby Lou in her hand, wonderingly, and gazed at her, and then she lifted a shining face to Omri. She's mine. It's my little girl, my little red girl. I sneaked her onto the seed tray just before you put it onto the chest. Isn't she just beautiful? Well, ain't she, though? Echoed Boone adoringly as Emma gently set her down on the parka at his side, and they fell into each other's arms. The freak storm was an absolute disaster for nearly everyone it touched, but for Omri, Patrick, and Emma, and for the little people, it was a godsend, in one way. The destruction it wreaked on Omri's home and the neighborhood was so extensive that what had gone just before was simply dislodged from the minds of the grown-ups. To begin with, Mr. Johnson's precious car was a total write-off. To make matters worse, or better, just as he was jumping up and down beside of it, ranting and raving at its destruction, a sizable branch from the dead elm broke off and descended on his head. After that, of course, though he recovered later, nobody was about to believe any tales he had to tell about little live men. Incidentally, the insurance company refused to pay up for the Porsche because cyclones were excluded in the small print. He would have to come to school on a bicycle, a sadder and humbler man. As for Omri's and Patrick's parents, they never exactly believed what Mr. Johnson tried to tell them just before they came rushing up the stairs, and afterward they simply never remembered it. The conservatory had been blown to pieces, the tree was blocking the road, and their chimney had fallen through the roof next door. The whole place looked as if a cyclone had struck it. There was no time even to think about anything else, once they had made sure their children were really all right. The storm had severely damaged the school, which was closed for several weeks. This naturally caused all of those who should have been learning then profound unhappiness, but they managed to make the best of things. Patrick's cottage in Kent was okay, but his mother's orchard, she had taken to cider making for a living since her divorce, had been devastated. The problems that this caused meant that she was only too glad to leave Patrick up in London for a time while she dealt with them. She never did get around to asking him where he had been during that fateful 24 hours when he was missing. So, all that was on the plus side, at least from the point of view on the street of the secret. On the minus side, where the condition of Omri's house, his parents' distress, and one other thing that loomed larger for him and the other two, not to mention Boone and Ruby, than anything else. As soon as possible, Omri got a ladder and unhooked the cupboard impaled through its back on the broken roof joist. He took a hammer and carefully flattened the bent bits of metal back into place until the hole was almost concealed. He measured the space for the mirror and went out and bought another one to match it and fitted it in. He fixed the hinges and he gave the whole thing a rub down with sandpaper and repainted it, after which it looked a good deal better than it had ever looked before. But all the time he was working on it, his heart was laden, and Patrick and Emma, when they could be there, said very little. Each knew all too well what was in the mind of the others. What Omri was so diligently, so devotedly working on was merely a memorial, a museum piece. The cupboard was of no practical use without the key. And the key was gone. Emma had taken over Ruby Lou, and since Ruby refused to be parted from him, Boone stayed with Patrick, who was living in Emma's house with his hand. Omri was utterly opposed to this, but he couldn't say much. The little people had hardly proved safe in his place, but he lived in abject terror of Tamsin or someone else finding out. Omri was having to share Gillen's room, so in a way he was glad not to have the responsibility of the little people, but there was cold terror in his heart nearly every waking moment, even though Emma and Patrick assured him that they were taking every precaution. It was evident to Omri that despite the dangers, or perhaps because of them, the two were having the greatest fun of their lives. Ruby and Boone were living in an old doll's house of Emma's, which, if not quite small enough for them, they had to really climb up the stairs and come down backward, contained plenty of things that they could use, like tables and chairs and beds and kitchen gadgets galore. What the doll's house didn't provide, Patrick and Emma did. Patrick had fixed them up with a little wood stove, complete with a stovepipe made of a tea tin that had a hole in the top of the right size for a real tiny frying pan. And with this, Ruby Lou could do some cooking. They used a special little loo, like a camping one, which Emma had arranged, and every day she brought them hot water for baths and tiny towels. Boone got to almost like washing. Every day there were new things to make and add. They even rigged up real electric lights that were a wondrous novelty for Boone and Ruby, though the switch was too stiff for them to work alone, and they really preferred a miniature but real oil lamp twice as tall as themselves. All this was fine for everyone but Omri. He felt very much alone and left out. Visiting occasionally and seeing for himself only made him sadder. He longed for Little Bear and Bright Stars to keep him company, or even Matron, but there was no way. There would never be any way again. It made his heart very heavy and very frightened when he thought of Boone and Ruby, with them forever unable to get home and in constant danger of discovery. One day, 2 weeks after the storm, Patrick and Emma went over to Omri's house. Boone and Ruby Lou asked us to bring them here, Emma explained. They want to talk about the future. The conference was held in Gillen's room, which, even though he was not around, was nerve-wracking. He might walk in at any moment. There was no bolt on his door. Besides, the roofers had at last arrived and were banging and crashing about, throwing down tiles into the front garden where they smashed on the stump of the tree, and were beginning to remove the broken beams preparatory to putting on a whole new roof. Every few seconds, something hurtled past the window and landed with a crash below. This meant that they might not hear Gillen if he approached. Omri closed the window and the curtains, and though it was broad daylight, to help keep out the noise. And then he switched Gillen's desk lamp on, and then they all sat around Ruby, Lou, and Boone, who were seated on a poof made of a large eraser. Listen, folks, Ruby began, as they all leaned forward to hear her. I wouldn't want to hurt y'all's feelings none, but, you kids have made us feel real welcome, giving us that special house and all, but we just can't settle here. It ain't safe. Every time a door opens, I get me a heart attack, and besides, I keep having nightmares about them big blowing up the world things that Pat told me about. Now we gonna get back home, but Billy here explained to me the whole thing about the key getting blowed away, and it's real bad news. What are we gonna do?" Nobody knew what to answer. The silence stretched. As always, when things were really desperate, Boone was dry-eyed and steady as a rock. "Couldn't we try some other key?" Omri said. "I have." The others looked at him. "With the cupboard, I tried every key in the house, just on the off chance, but none of them even fit." "Well, that sure is a pity with the cupboard looking so new and fine. Makes me want to jump right in," said Boone sadly. Ruby put her arm around his shoulders. "Don't you start now, Billy, or you'll have me bawling too." "I ain't bawling," said Boone, "but I sure am getting mighty homesick. I guess it could just make a man cry to think of never riding the prairies or the deserts again, or even settling his favorite hat back on his ears." This did cause him to give a deep sniff. "And another thing, how's me and Ruby going to get hitched if and we can't even get us a preacher? 'Tain't right us living in this house together, even in separate rooms when the knot ain't tied." Well, Ruby gave him a look that suggested that she might not have worried too much about that, but she glanced at Emma and said nothing. "It looks to me," said Emma, "as if we'll just have to do it just to keep trying keys. Old keys. Just keep trying until we found one that works." Again, they were silent. None of them believed that would ever happen, and this business was a one-off, and they all knew it. And meanwhile, what?" said Boone. "And just keep on as you are, I'm afraid," said Omri with a deep, miserable sigh. They had something to eat, and Omri, who had a special tea prepared, tried to turn it into a bit of a party, but it was no use. They were all just too upset and scared about the future to enjoy it. At last, Emma put Ruby into her pocket, and Boone, with some assistance, clambered to his favorite perch with a leg each side of Patrick's ear, facing out and well masked by his hair. He said it was the nearest thing to riding. Omri went out with them to the gate. The roofers had gone home for the day, leaving the front garden in chaos. There were tiles and broken bits of wood everywhere. The front lawn and the hedge dividing the garden from Hovel Road were all chopped up and smothered with debris. "Dad'll go ape when he sees this," said Omri, and then he stopped. He'd seen something that in the first second he didn't comprehend, because it didn't belong. Not that bright color. He paused to look closer, and the others were ahead of him, starting down the road toward the station, and Omri reached up his hand to the top of the hedge, and then he saw what it was. He didn't shout and jump and cheer. It was too important for that. He simply stood there with his hand raised, touching it, not pulling it, just feeling deep inside him what it meant. That narrow bit of red satin ribbon sticking out between the twigs. Epilogue, at a wedding. It was a marvelous, unforgettable occasion. They all came. Matron. They had to send her back briefly, but when they explained that where they had brought her, to change out of her uniform, "Not remotely suitable." She reappeared in a smart navy blue suit, a snow-white blouse with lots of unexpected frills down the front, and a funny little hat like a crooked flower pot with a dotted veil. She was even wearing a trace of lipstick. Thickets emerged with his sergeant's stripes, with his newly confident manner after the battle of the skinheads, had earned him almost as soon as he had returned to his company. When he understood the occasion, he wanted to go back to recruit a Royal Marine Guard of Honor, but he was dissuaded by Boone, who modestly said that he wanted things quiet, with just me and my best friends present. And of course, his best friends had to include his blood brother, Little Bear, and his family. Little Bear arrived in full regalia, his headdress, his cloak, and all of his finery. He had them on for a celebration of a victory. Not a final one, no doubt, but still a victory. In the 2 weeks since he had been back in his village, a great deal had happened, which he related to them during the wedding eve feast. The Algonquians, having regrouped after the previous battle, which Omri had witnessed, had mounted another attack and had been repulsed. "How did you do it, Little Bear? You lost so many men last time." "Wise chief, learn not only from victory, defeat also teach," said Little Bear, virtuously but vaguely. "It's strange that when you had the now guns, you couldn't beat them, but without them, you could." "Best use Indian weapons, as Omri say." Little Bear's tone was now definitely evasive. Omri was not inclined to press him, but Boone unexpectedly was. "Using only bows and arrows? You beat 'em hollow, eh, Redskin?" he asked. Little Bear inclined his head. "Oh, yeah? So you never even used my six-shooter that you stole off me, huh?" Well, Little Bear's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed to menacing slits. "Little Bear not steal white brother weapon." "Well, you did, 'cause I had my eyes open a mite, and I seen you do it. And one of them times you come to look me over when I was laid there helpless," he went on, while Little Bear became more and more uncomfortable. "Little Bear!" exclaimed Omri, shocked. "You didn't!" "Not steal," shouted Little Bear. "Take, not steal. Here, I give weapon back." He pulled the revolver out from under his cloak and thrust it into Boone's hand. "Real good of you, seeing you ain't got no more use for it now it's plumb empty. Where's all the bullets, Indian brother?" Well, Little Bear's earlier discomfiture had evaporated, and now he drew himself up proudly. "One bullet, one enemy," he boasted. "What? You downed 6 of 'em?" Boone held up one hand and a thumb. "That's right good shooting for a beginner." Well, he tucked his gun away in its holster. "Well, guess I'll have to reckon that I lent it in a good cause, and you'll have to reckon on going back to the old ways next time." Well, Little Bear scowled. "And hard to go back old ways after new ways," he muttered. Bright Stars, with Tall Bear strapped to her back, was also wearing a beautiful dress, covered with elaborate decoration. She rivaled the bride until Ruby Lou thought of a way to dress up even more. She persuaded Emma to go and buy a model wedding set that included a plastic bride. Emma was not too happy about this. "But what are you going to do when I bring her to life? Just rip the dress off of her and leave her there in her undies?" "Well, no, of course not. I'm going to buy it off of her." "Buy it? With what with?" "This." And she pulled out a minute leather pouch with a drawstring and chinked it against her palm. Emma's eyes popped. "It's not gold, is it?" "Sure is." She tipped the bag a little, and something winked in her tiny hand. "I reckon a few gold dollars ought to pay for a wedding dress. I just hope I like it when I see it was made real." So it was done. Ruby went into the cupboard after the bride had been brought to life and emerged triumphant with a dress, a gorgeous thing of white silk and 1,000 tiny lace ruffles over her arm. "Don't tell me that she was at the altar when we brought her," said Emma. "No, she was just trying it on. She told me she didn't like the darn thing much anyhow. It made her look fat." "Well, can't all have a figure like yours, Ruby," said Boone proudly. The preacher was none other than Tickle. Bringing him was no easy task. There were several false tries. They first brought to life the parson from Emma's wedding models. But of course, he wasn't Tickle. He was just a parson, a pallid youth, who took one look through the cupboard door, offered up an anguished prayer, and fainted dead away. So, in the end, they went to the model shop with Ruby and looked at every plastic figure in the place till they found a Western saloon scene with a little man at a piano. And Ruby said, "That's him." And it was. So they got to the piano, too. Tickle was terrified at first. He insisted the whole thing was the devil's work and refused to believe that it could be happening. But Ruby and Boone took him aside and persuaded him that it was all part of the great design, and what really would be sinful was if he left Ruby and Boone unhitched. After a few pulls from a hip pocket flask he happened to have on him, he allowed himself to be drawn to his piano, and after practicing a few hymns, which he hadn't played since the Deadeye Gang had burned down his church, he gradually worked himself into a devout mood and agreed to play his part. "Well, he ain't much of a preacher man," confided Boone to Patrick, tapping his forehead. "He went downhill fast after they burned his church. The liquor, ain't everyone's got a head for it like me, but he still got it in him to do what's right." "Well, You ought to help rebuild the church, Boone, prompted Emma. Who, me? Exclaimed Boone. But Ruby gave him a nudge and said, yep, good idea, maybe. The wedding was held in Omri's room. It was rather dark because the hole in the roof was still covered with a big roofer's canvas. There wasn't any furniture except the built-in bunk, but they spread a sheet over the floor and lit a circle of candles and set everything up the way that they wanted it. There was a tiny altar made of a piece of decorative stone with a single daisy on it, a stained glass window made of scraps of colored tissue paper with a candle shining through it, and of course a feast of food, including a miniature wedding cake that Emma had found in a rather posh baker's. It was still as big as a table to the bride and groom, but Little Bear would help cut it with his knife. They had lots of crisps crushed fine, and hundreds and thousands of dishes made in from tiny shells from a necklace of Emma's. There was 7-Up for champagne. The cupboard was nearby, a little to one side. Its door was symbolically ajar, and the recovered key was in the lock. Emma, who had a feeling for these things, had made a little triumphal arch of flowers and a Lego step leading up to the bottom rim. No one mentioned it, but they all knew the little people were going to go home through it as soon as the wedding party ended. Patrick, Emma, and Omri had a long, fraught discussion about the whole business. This has got to be the end of it. It was Omri who said it. Patrick knew it too, but he couldn't come right out with it. It was Emma who didn't accept it, who put up a fight. It's all right for you two, she raged. She was nearly in tears. You've had it for ages, last year, and you've time-traveled. It's not fair. It's just not fair. Well, we've got to, Em. It's too dangerous for them. Well, we could keep them a secret. We have. For how long? Asked Patrick quietly. Before Tamsin finds out? It's been a pretty near thing once or twice already, or someone else. Emma was silent. She was struggling with her tears. The boys were uncomfortable. They understood too clearly how she felt, because they felt it too, more than she did. But I love Ruby, Emma burst out. I can't give her up, never ever see her again. It's like telling me I have to say yes to her dying. The boys didn't look at each other. Well, I've been thinking about the wind, said Omri slowly. What do you mean, the wind? The cyclone. It's done an awful lot of damage. It ripped down millions of trees, and it practically destroyed Kew Gardens and lots of other places. So what? What's that got to do with anything? It wasn't our fault. Well, I think it was. The other two looked at him. Look, we interfered. We felt bad about the Indians dying, and now we've done this. Don't you understand? Everything that happened. Boone being hurt, the cyclone, even Mr. Johnson's car, it's us. It all happened because we found out a magic trick and messed around with time. Well, good things happen too, said Patrick defensively. Like what? Well, we helped Little Bear defeat his enemies. Yeah, well, he'd probably have done that anyway, and now we've shown him modern weapons, and you see what it led to, him borrowing Boone's revolver because it made killing so much easier. Well, that's going to happen anyway, said Patrick slowly. He, too, had been doing some reading. White men coming along, interfering, if you like to call it that, changing the Indians' way of life. It had already well begun in Little Bear's time. He knew all about it. He knew all about guns. We only gave a little push to what was bound to happen. Omri thought about what he'd read about the way American Indians live now, in reservations, their hunting grounds taken from them, their songs and their gods discredited and lost, many of them alcoholics, beginning only recently to struggle back to their own old ways and traditions and beliefs, after centuries of bad times, horrible times. I don't want to give that kind of push, he said. It's got to end. The other two were silent. Emma gave a deep sniff, and then she said, But as long as we've got the key, we'll always be tempted. Omri reviewed the many, many thoughts that he had had about that. He had envisioned himself burying the key, but he knew that wouldn't do. Better throw it away, into the Thames, into the sea. He tried to imagine himself doing what he knew to be the right thing, but every time something stopped him. In his imagination, he would draw back his hand. The key would be about to fly from it, to sink, to drown, to be lost forever. And he would stop. He could never do it. The solution he had arrived at was not perfect, but it was the best he could do. It had been born of the deep, long, strong fear that he had suffered, and the pain of knowing that they had meddled where they shouldn't, and had done a lot of harm. I'm going to ask my dad to take it from me and put it in the bank. I'll make a secret package of it with the cupboard. He won't know what it is. He'll tell them to keep it in a vault and not give it back till I'm dead. Emma and Patrick stared at him, awestruck. Dead? Omri nodded solemnly. But who will they give it back to, then? My children. Emma spoiled the moment by giggling, the idea of Omri having children. But then his solemn face took her laughter away, and she said, And will they know? Will you tell them what it is, what it does? Well, I'll tell them a story. I won't tell them it's true. I'll leave it up to them. That way it won't quite be lost. Only to us. We've done enough. The Reverend Tickle played the wedding march as the bride came up the aisle. Matron was at her side to give her away. Little Bear and Fickets were best men. It needed two to support Boone, because at this last moment he was seized by an attack of nerves. I can't go through with it. I ain't good enough for her, he muttered, his face flushed crimson through his bristles. Sides, a man can't get hitched without a hat. 'Tain't legal, and I'm a-getting out of here. And he turned to flee, but Little Bear and Fickets laid strong hands on him and held him firmly until his bride reached him. Ruby Lou, in a wedding gown, with her blonde hair down and a lace veil floating around her like a mist, was very different from Ruby Lou in her scarlet satin. Boone was so smitten at the sight of her that he was struck dumb and his knees buckled. Luckily, Tickle had anticipated this, and as he quickly moved from the piano stool to the altar to begin the service, he discreetly passed his flask to Fickets, who gave Boone a restoring swig. "My very last," Boone vowed, but even Ruby, tenderly taking his arm, didn't look as if she quite believed him. Just near the end, Bright Star's baby began to cry. Matron tutted and said, "Shh," but Little Bear and Bright Stars looked at each other and beamed. "Good omen," cried Little Bear, interrupting the I-do's. "Baby's voice, sign of health, long life, many hope, much children." And he let out a marvelous baying cry of pleasure that sent a shiver of excitement and happiness through them all. That does it for our Indian in the Cupboard trilogy of books that we've been reading through all these months. And of course, we'll be taking a break from these books. We're going to be reading a little bit about Corona and the Island of the Blue Dolphins for our very next book. But I suppose it would be fun to hear just a little bit about Lynn Reed Banks if you're interested. Lynn Reed Banks was born in London in 1929, and she spent World War II on the Canadian prairies as a war guest. On returning home, she studied drama and acted for 5 years. She then went into journalism, becoming the first woman TV news reporter in Britain in 1955. In 1960, her first novel, The L-Shaped Room, was published, and it was later filmed. In 1962, she immigrated to Israel, where she married, had 3 sons, and spent 8 years living on a kibbutz and teaching English. She returned to London with her family in 1971 and became a full-time writer. She has written more than 40 books, mainly novels for adults and young readers, including the award-winning Indian in the Cupboard series, I, Houdini, The Farthest Away Mountain, and The Fairy Rebel. Lynn Reed Banks lives in a 300-year-old farmhouse in Dorset, England, with her husband. She often travels and visits schools at home and abroad. That was just a little bit about the lady who wrote the books. So guys, thank you so much for listening. I really enjoyed this one. I thought The Secret of the Indian might have been the very strongest one out of all the books. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care.